Why has no one skied to the North Pole since 2014? Hauling a sledge, on foot or on skis, from the edge of the Arctic Ocean to the Geographic North Pole is firmly in the top drawer of the more technically, physically and emotionally demanding, unforced tasks a human being might set themselves. Many people are at least vaguely aware that for well over 100 years there's been a small cohort of people who dedicate themselves to trying to stay alive whilst hauling more than their own body weight over various types of winter terrain across hundreds of miles of ice, and punctuated, depending on where you are, by crevasses, predatory bears, storms, ever-moving ice ridges and open water. Let's be frank, these expeditions are symbolic. There is nothing valuable to be found at either North or South Pole. The ice a mile to the left or the right, you would not be able to tell it apart. Indeed, the ice moves around, quickly at the North Pole and very slowly at the South. I want to stick to the topic posed in the title, but I think it's fair to get those of you who are incomprehensibly less than encyclopedic on polar travel up to speed with what's happened up to this moment. So I'll attempt a rundown of North Pole exploratory history in 2 minutes, or 2 minutes-ish. Initial attempts to travel on sea ice, or afloat amongst pack ice, or in early aircraft like airships, sought to work out what on earth was to be found at the top of the world. Motivations changed. At first there was a hope to find dry land to stake a claim to. When it was clear that there was none, North Polar exploration became about potential shipping shortcuts, national and imperial pride, and a closely associated personal glory for the explorers. A little over a century ago, Americans Frederick Cook and Robert Peary made competing claims of success over the ice barely a year apart from each other. The former was a liar and a crook. The latter was a liar and a child abuser. Next, the world was distracted by 2 world wars, although the interwar period did see the first overflights of the pole. Post-war, some Soviet comrades stood at the pole after being flown in. People overflew it some more, a few landed, and a US submarine paid a visit. But on-ice expeditions only picked up in the late 60s. Ralph Pleisted's team first with lots of support, and Wally Herbert's with dogs the year after, crossing the entire ocean via the pole. But we were landing on the moon, so no one paid much attention. There was a fair amount of Cold War activity, but what I call the era of modern classic expeditions really picked up around 1990. These look more similar to today. Small teams or even soloists on skis, hauling plastic composite sledges. The firsts came thick and fast. Borghausland in 1994 with the first unsupported North Pole journey, which was also solo, and in 1995 Richard Webber and Misha Malakoff made the one and only unsupported return journey to and from land. Start points were generally the northern shores of Canadian and Siberian high Arctic islands, with a handful of private logistics companies seeing fit to offer drop-off, pick-up and rescue cover. From 2000 to roughly the year of the financial crash 8 years later, there were multiple expeditions operating each year, and the emergence of novices being led by professional guides. Also, heavily truncated week-long adventure holiday expeditions, made possible principally by the temporary ice camp called Barneo, first set up in 1991. The splurge of activity dried up by the year 2010-ish. Private aircraft and helicopter companies pulled out due to worsening ice conditions and a high hassle to profit ratio. 2014 saw the final full-distance human-powered expedition. Barneo Camp, the final private expedition facilitator, became increasingly unreliable, chiefly due to wrangling and politics, then COVID, and hasn't operated in 6 consecutive years. Now, we're up to date. Through all of history, fewer than 250 people have travelled on ice from land to the North Pole, and almost a third of those in a 10-year span. That was, I have no idea how many minutes, probably not 2 minutes, but I guess close enough.
Alex, that wasn't even close to 2 minutes. Try harder next time.
I'll delve into some of that in more detail as I give the reasons for the current situation, but you now get the picture. Early historic exploratory forays towards the pole and their style tracked the changes in technology over decades, but were always political at the core. The commercialisation, individualism, and let's call it sportification, came to be towards the end of the last century. There was this decade of renewed North Pole expedition fever, billed and marketed, not inaccurately, as the most demanding exploratory goal on the Earth's surface, and now it's all rather collapsed. There are reasons for this, but I do also want to envisage and share with you what I think may come next, if anything. Let's do the environment first, as it's the headline clincher that people tend to reach for first, and the only factor that could pass as mainstream news, and not an idiosyncrasy of the niche exploration world. To ski, walk, haul or snowshoe, I tend to use the umbrella term ski for simplicity here, to the North Pole, quote unquote properly, you must start from land. It's a common sense start point. Otherwise you get into a real mess of comparing like with like. If you start offshore, how far offshore? Comparisons are tricky anyhow, as different start points bring with them different ice conditions. Crumpled and chaotic pack ice over here, and looser drift ice with open water cracks to deal with over there. Positive drift as the ice moves over here, and negative drift over here. And that's only some of the time, there's no certainty. This is under 500 miles, this is over 600, this is around 1,000 miles. Pros and cons all over the place. We don't have a stable, uniformly constructed running track where lane accommodations are made to make it fair on all competitors. Then, of course, expeditions are not head-to-head. Whether one year may be stormy and another relatively calm, one year could be frigid and the next relatively balmy. One expedition may be openly competitive and another authentically seeing it as a personal odyssey and not giving a monkeys. None of this changes the need to start from land, and whilst those stepping off from Canada and Russia could reasonably expect a consistent ice route north through the 80s and 90s, change was afoot by a few years into our new century. Multiple teams sharing a helicopter to start their journeys off the Russian Cape at Zemlya in 2004 found broken and missing ice off the shorelines. Most opted to be flown to the ice's edge, and to justify their decision later. Soloist Dominique Ardouin, I think that's how you pronounce her name, apparently kicked up a fuss, demanding a shoreline start. The pilot complied, and she was never seen again. The Arctic Ocean is partly covered with a frozen layer of sea ice year-round, the pans and chunks of ice that survive the summer each year becoming multi-year ice. Each winter and spring, the extent grows substantially with lots of new first-year ice, which itself can thicken to well over a foot thick, and so facilitates surface travel perfectly well. Due to the currents and gyres, most of the year-round ice collects against the Canadian and Greenlandic coast, with most of the open water around the Alaskan, Russian and Scandinavian side during the summer. In the past though, reliable ice formed through the midwinter all the way to the majority of these coastlines. The whole Russian swathe which dominates the Arctic Ocean, the Alaska coast and through the Bering Strait even a little into the northern Pacific. The least icy zone is where the North Atlantic meets the Arctic. This is due to the warm Gulf Stream current heading up from the south, and the transpolar drift pushing pack ice south, breaking its edges off as it goes. While some past expeditions have used the islands of Svalbard as a finish point, generally this southbound conveyor belt is why it's not been seen as a start point for those reasons, despite being so far north. As the decade we call the noughties progressed, it became clear that all was not well with the Russian Cape as a viable start point, even as permits were still being granted despite the cooling relationship between Putin's Russia and the West. Those starting there had to accept steeply rising fees for drop-offs into the hundreds of thousands of dollars each, and compromise in that they couldn't start on land. I received an email from the Russian logistics guys in 2009 when I inquired about a Russian start, joking that there was enough ice at the Cape at expedition start time, the early spring, perhaps, and I quote, for a cocktail but no more. Purists did try to continue to launch expeditions from the Canadian start at Ward Hunt Island, a tiny rock off the northern edge of Ellesmere Island, and there were a few ideas like doing the expedition in reverse, pole to land, but in general we were trending down until the final couple of trips a decade ago. Some might argue that different concepts, some winners and some losers since, like amphibious vehicles or from boat to boat via the pole crossing part of the ocean on skis, make nonsense of a claim that true expeditions have ceased. But it's not that easy. These new solutions are fundamentally different, and that includes the Ausland Horn late autumn early winter trip from Horn's expedition yacht in 2019, which despite lacking full distance credentials, I suspect will sit amongst the greatest Arctic Ocean ski journeys of the modern era. So, the ice was the first reason for our North Pole expedition dearth. Then, money. All factors are of course linked, and they've had a tendency to combine and escalate. The more soloists and teams needing drop-offs and pickups, the more can coordinate and share costs. Generally, medium-sized helicopters and small ski-equipped planes were used for these sorts of private charter flights, and since there's often only one or two good weather windows to fly in and start per season, sharing was once very common. A flight costing the same as a small house can instead cost each team the same as just a new car instead. This brought funding into the purview of not those just with fabulous personal wealth or huge sponsors, but those with more modest backers or even self-funding. But as sharing grew harder and expedition failure rates increased, before launch or even on the ice, fewer people took the risk, and so the vicious cycle made sharing logistics costs yet harder. The days of being able to launch a modern, classic-style, aircraft-reliant North Pole expedition for £100,000 or less were over. Fees the operators charged for charter flights and security deposits were increasing far beyond inflation, and that brings us neatly to the third reason. The companies running the specialised aircraft got fed up. Let's do the Russian side first, as it's a little more cut and dried. To reach the extreme northerly islands of Siberia, you need lots of permits and permissions, and also to be in effect chaperone for security reasons. Plus, you need to satisfy the logistics business that flies you there that you are a reasonable, practical and financial risk. Relations with the West in the 1990s and for the opening decade of Putin's reign were broadly workable. By and large, these North Pole insertion flights went to plan, albeit with a few mechanical issues which are unsurprising with aging Cold War era helicopters. But these multi-leg flights with fuel resupplies on the way, and with flight crews often then needed to fly out of the Borneo ice base a few weeks later, often relied on teams sharing the charter, as I mentioned, or some other sort of deal like one solo skier hitching a ride with a cargo flight for costs to be viable. Once ice off the Cape retreated even at sea ice extent maximum, so we're talking February-March time, and then the amount of City Slicker sponsored trips tailed off after the financial crisis, this option became hard to justify. The helicopter operator became reluctant to bother organising as underfunded teams kept pulling out just weeks before the flight. By the early 2010s, you needed to fly a long way offshore to find the pack ice, and the allure of this route was gone. On the other side of the ocean, Alaska was never a modern classic ski route due to the distance. Alaska, even on the northern coasts, isn't actually that far north. See? Greenland, for the most part, has a tricky northern coast where the ice will want to pull you east, and so we're talking about that Canadian zone that I mentioned. There's nothing save for a science hut and other derelict bits and bobs at Ward Hunt, so usually the DHC-6 Twin Otter prop aircraft, they touch down, offload and head back southwest. Most are based at Resolute Bay and can use the weather station at Eureka as a refuel or weather delay stop. More than 20 years ago, unlikely though it seems, there was something approaching competition for insertion flights to the coast, and then long non-stop pickup flights from the North Pole a couple of months later. For those, the Twin Otters needed to carry drums of fuel internally and refuel mid-flight. They also latterly flew in pairs for safety, at additional cost of course. Kemboric Air, the tundra and Arctic charter specialist headquartered in Calgary, have been dominant for decades in the ski plane logistics business, and even fly much of their fleet to the Antarctic for jobs in the austral summer. They flew, and fly, all sorts of people around the Canadian North, from government contracts to village passenger flights, from cargo to scientific surveys. Plus they were open to North Pole expedition support flights, including emergency cover for medevacs. So we had Kemboric with their iconic, or at least iconic to polar people, colour scheme. But also other airlines had Twin Otters. Even First Air, one of the commercial passenger airlines connecting the Canadian provinces with the territories up north, and also running shuttles between the small towns and villages, had a few. So if the timing and money was right, they did fly private high Arctic charters as well. So what went wrong? Another cascade of events that overlapped. One of the first was the dropping out of all of the aircraft operators flying Twin Otters, bar Kemboric Air. As far as I know, First Air sold theirs to Boric, and the few that Air Greenland had have long since been sold to an Icelandic charter company, or used for spare parts, as new Twin Otters were for a time not made. The result, a near monopoly, which doesn't tend to favour customers when it comes to contractual terms or prices. Another factor was the huge increase in expeditions after the millennium, and the reduced general standard of competence. Some of the trips had near novices with guides showing them how whilst on the ice, and there were other small teams with lots and lots of cash, but very few hours on ice. As a result, for Kemboric too, rather like the Russians, the hassle factor became too much. Teams were booking dates and even paid a deposit, but then pulled out, or they managed a day or two on the ice before needing an urgent pickup from a tricky location. A pickup from the destination, the North Pole, was often cheaper via the Russian ice base if skiers got there in time, so Kemboric was often left with the lower profit drop-off job, a complex logistical and aircraft scheduling jigsaw puzzle, and need to provide emergency air cover for most of the expedition and then not even get the extraction flight contract. If they were to drop off a team, they were rather committed ethically to whatever happened to them next, and reputation matters of course. There were a few publicised arguments between expeditions and Kemboric when it came to where and when a pickup was possible. Kemboric was, and is, in high demand for other specialist bush pilot and ice runway contracts, and by 2015 was evidently fed up of private North Pole expeditions that weren't frequent or reliable enough to be lucrative. So they officially pulled out. They are unlikely to even do a drop-off, even if absolved of responsibility for that point forward. It's an objective business decision. So that's more or less it. There's a private helicopter fleet servicing the oil fields in northern Alaska, but they lack the range or positioning to restart this particular micro-industry. All the other small bush pilot companies in Canada fly only further south, mostly between villages in the tundra, rivers and along coasts. Larger charter aircraft are too expensive and can't land on sea ice, so you need to parachute, and they never let you do that. Air Greenland do not fly offshore and no longer have any ski-equipped planes. Norland Air in Iceland, if you pay them the enormous positioning flight fee, are prepared to devise flight plans to northern Greenland or northeast Canada, but the cost would be extraordinary, and they are reluctant to work in the dark season or on pack ice. It's possible though. There are no operators from northern Scandinavia that can help deliver North Pole expedition logistics, and that then leaves the Russian ice camp Barneo. Even if you managed to get to a start point and wanted them as a finish target, the camp hasn't opened for years due to every which reason. Plus, their operating window was barely 3 weeks long by the time they last set up and ran trips. They used to originally span late March, all of April, plus a bit of May. All through this chat with you, the walrus in the room has been ice. None of these factors I've mentioned are acting in isolation, and you can tie together the points that I've made so far about money, aircraft operators and expedition numbers, in that they are prisoners to what the ice is doing every year. How you feel about the cause or implications of Arctic Ocean sea ice cover is by the by. What's happened is that the ice now makes full North Pole expeditions either compromised in terms of purity or out of the question altogether. I'm going to finish off with a lesser but not insignificant factor. Culture. And no, not silly people trying to break made-up world records by composing and playing music at the North Pole. That's not culture. Nor in terms of Arctic indigenous culture, given that with a few notable exceptions, native Arctic people have shown very little interest in exploratory expeditions that are about conquest, sport, or other such intangibles. I'm talking instead about expedition culture. As with any other endeavour that evolves over decades and combines a need for creativity, technology, athletic prowess, profit and risk, marketing, and storytelling, a culture will develop and then vary. The types of people, their purpose, their ambitions, what they use to help them, and how they do or don't communicate it at all with the rest of us, we have to tie that all together. We could call the earliest exploratory culture imperial in nature, and then there have been militaristic times, grand man of history years, technology-led times, science and research, a profit-driven culture, an egotistic playboy era, and some of these have come and gone more than once. They've also overlapped with each other, but we can reasonably say that the North Pole expedition community has had a distinct sort of character to it in each decade. Our current decade is defined by the almost total lack of activity or interest. A full North Pole expedition, as with most large-scale exploratory projects, requires vast commitment and skill over not just the weeks of travel, but for months or years before. Patience is required. It's perhaps no surprise then that for the impulse for short, snappy, simple communication and short attention spans means that it's hard to capitalise on expeditions. You can succeed professionally online with broadcast and messaging through quick overnight camping trips instead. Sponsors like that sort of thing, at the moment anyway. Safer, quicker, lots of content and cheap. Add on to that a sort of overexposure to polar stuff. All those city workers who paid for their guided adventure trips 10 or 15 years ago. The wider audience has become jaded and disinterested. Most people in the corporate world of work have been subjected to a cookie-cutter, predictable motivational speech by a quote-unquote polar explorer who conveniently forgets to mention the paid guide who did all the cooking in the tent every night. Your boss might have even done one of those short commercial ones themselves back in the day and will never let you forget that they did. So there's another reason why North Pole expeditions are over for now. The public doesn't care like they once did, and practically no one doing these journeys can tolerate other people not caring about their trials and tribulations on the ice. This will change, I'm sure, as the online world changes yet more and markets change and unknown unknowns come along. I'm going to close with a forecast, the decade ahead, what I think will or won't happen for North Pole expeditions. The aircraft operators aren't going to do an about-face and re-enter the market, and new ones won't appear. The financial clout needed to make unlikely things happen could appear from a couple of sources. The first, someone with vast wealth who happens to be interested in polar travel. Second, a personality-driven individual brand or team sprouting from either the current crop of online media platforms or whichever one is next to appear and take its turn to grab attention and dominate before people grow weary once again. We're going to have more and more interest in the Arctic generally, mostly due to geopolitics, military ramping up in the north, and ice-free water making cargo shipping increasingly normalised on the Arctic Ocean. But this is government-level stuff, or a matter for large shipping and freight logistics companies, not for small-scale private activities. I suspect we'll see the occasional attempts using creative logistics punctuating the coming years, but nothing like the return of the commercial high Arctic expedition mini-era. What may happen though is the growth of something in the middle, and with branching motivations. NGO, small company, university-sized projects, perhaps networked together to pool resources and efforts. Their aims, I suspect, will be scientific, but with an infrastructure that then paves the way for commercial exploitation for sure, and support, or perhaps a mere grudging coexistence, with a new generation of independent exploratory projects, earning their place through an ability to be ahead of the curve in how they communicate online. These mid-sized projects will need to sort out the key components: a mode of efficient and reliable transport, easy access to and from the Arctic Ocean, ability to carry significant weight, both people and stuff, some form of emergency rescue cover, the ability to keep non-expert polar travellers safe, maybe year-round storage on the ocean itself. Who knows how this might be achieved, and who might pick up the baton? People of the channel, welcome to the new problem, the next one to be solved. More soon. Bye.